Welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of the Institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are sitting on today, particularly the Darug people of the Darug Nation, where the Institute is located in Parramatta, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Today, we are very pleased to have Professor David Walker and Professor Stephen FitzGerald for this live Q&A. It's going to be a very interesting, stimulating, and informative session. Let me just briefly introduce the two speakers. Professor David Walker is the Alfred Deakin Professor at Deakin University and the inaugural PhD Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University from 2013 to 2016. And Professor Walker has visited many universities in China. Professor Walker is also a fellow of Social Sciences, Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and the Australian Academies of the Humanities. Above all, Professor Walker is a great historian and a great writer. I just love reading his books. Professor Stephen FitzGerald is adjunct professor at Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture and distinguished fellow at the Whitlam's Institute, both at Western Sydney University. Professor FitzGerald is the Australian first ambassador to China from 1973 to 1976. And his memoir, Comrade Ambassador, Whitlam's Beijing Envoy, is a fascinating and rich book full of incredible historical events. Professor FitzGerald is also the Vice President of the Museum of Chinese in Australia. Just a few words about how the session will be run. We will first invite Professor David Walker to tell us the intentions of writing these two books, followed by the Q&A between Professor Walker and Professor FitzGerald. During the Q&A, you are all invited and encouraged to post your questions in the Q&A section function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them and read them out to the speakers to respond. Now, please welcome Professor David Walker and Professor Stephen FitzGerald. David, you can start.
Thank you very much, Jing, and thank you for your institute for hosting this occasion. And Stephen, thank you for participating as well, given your deep experience and great knowledge of the subjects that we're addressing today. Anxious Nation and Stranded Nation cover the period from about the 1850s through to the 1970s. And they address Australian responses to rising Asia across that period. Let me say a little bit about the titles, because that may suggest some of what each of the books attempts to do. In referring to anxiety, to Anxious Nation, I didn't want to create an impression of a nation that was paranoid or frothing at the mouth with anxiety, or it was something that was somehow deeply disturbed. But I wanted to suggest a pervasive concern, apprehension, unease about the discovery that Australia was not as close to the British world as it might have hoped, but was far closer to the Asian world than it really liked. So that was a discovery from the late 19th century, that Australia belonged in a region, or sat in a region, was geographically located in a region which it felt pretty uncomfortable about and culturally unconnected to. So the anxiety runs through the story, but I also argue that there are other themes. There's a sense of opportunity for some people, a sense of emerging markets, the idea that being close to Asia might not be such a bad thing. When we come to the Stranded Nation, which really looks at the period from the 1930s through to the 1970s, the notion I'm trying to convey there is that Australia found itself in a world, particularly from the 1940s, in which Asia was decolonizing very rapidly. So the Asian nations that had kept the Asian world pretty much under the thumb down to the Second World War were retreating. Australia found itself in a region of increasingly independent and increasingly vocal Asian nations. Yet through the 1950s and 60s, it still really hadn't engaged Asia or got close to Asia. So it was neither fish nor fowl, if you like. It was neither part of the British and European world, or as much of part of that and securely part of that as it might have wanted to be. And yet it still hadn't found its place in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific or the region to which Australia belonged. The other point I'd make quickly is that I see the two books as, in a sense, complementary to the idea of Asia literacy, which Stephen was very much involved in promulgating, in that it seems to me that in order for us to have effective Asia literacy, we also need to have an effective understanding, a deeper understanding than we have of our history of connection to engagement with, concern about Asia. And that history goes back much further than we commonly recognise. So we often talk about engagement happening from the late 1980s or whenever, 1990s. But in fact, I would suggest that we really need to go back into the 19th century and carry that story forward over a longer historical trajectory to get a better sense of Australia's thinking about rising Asia. And we need to know that, because unless we know ourselves, unless we know how we've thought about Asia, unless we know what we've projected onto Asia, we can't be in a good place to understand contemporary debates about the rise of China, our place in the region, racial prejudice, and so on. So that's, Jean, that is my opening gambit. I lay it on the table.
David.
Yes.
Can I say these two books together are, I think, an extraordinary contribution to our understanding of where we've come from in this whole complex business of our relations with Asia. I think, I mean, they are so good, and as Jean said in her introduction, they are so readable. I've actually written that the latest one, Stranded Nation, reads like a novel. Not that it is fiction, of course, but it's got that wonderful flow to it, and it's full of the most extraordinary characters. And you pick these characters up and you allow them to speak in their own voice, and this really brings that history off the pages. I think they are so good that when people ask me, and this happens at least once a week, you know, what books would I recommend for them to understand where we're coming from on Asia? I recommend these two. And as to your point that we need to understand ourselves in this story and what's happened and where we've come from, I've also written that I wish that I'd had these books with me in earlier parts of my life, including when I was working in Beijing. It would have helped me to understand a lot more about those who went before me, the people who were on various sides of the debate about Australia's engagement with Asia. So this is the contribution, and it's been, it seems, a career-long engagement, intellectual engagement that you've had with this subject, with this broad subject. So I want to start with a personal question, if I may. What set you on this path?
Thank you for the comments, Stephen. I appreciate them very much, and so much so that I'm happy for you to repeat them as often as you wish. It's an interesting question about what got me started on it. One of my uncles was a member of the Royal Australian Air Force and was captured on the island of Ambon and executed by the Japanese, beheaded by the Japanese in February 1942. He was an uncle I didn't ever get to meet, of course, but his story always lurked in the background of the family history. And so I knew that there was something going on there about Japan and about his life and his experience, which always intrigued me, but the family was very reluctant to speak about it openly. So it sat there as a kind of a mystery around that figure and around what had become of him. So I was always kind of interested to know what that meant. I should also point out that I was, Mr. Menzies thought that I'd be a very valuable asset in defeating the downward thrust of communism in Vietnam. So I was conscripted for service in Vietnam, and discovered at that point that this is where the scholarly career comes in, Steve. Discovered at that point that you could do a primary degree and you could do one degree after that. And the family had no idea, nor did I, what a PhD was. But I very quickly discovered that the PhD was the longest degree known to humanity. So I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to give some thought to doing one of them. So I did an undergraduate degree at Adelaide, did honours in history, which I enjoyed very much, became deeply engaged in and interested in history. And so going on to do a PhD seemed a sensible thing to do. I had to do that in Australia because as a conscripted person, I was not permitted to leave the country.
And as you really got into this, I mean, if you started with this barely understood image of what had happened, the Japanese, the beheading, and so on. What was the first discovery for you when you really got into the history of this issue?
Well, one of the discoveries was actually, it was also a teaching discovery, because I went to, I had a lecturing position at the University of New South Wales, and I was teaching Australian history there. And I had quite a number of discussions with one of my colleagues there, John Ingleson, who was an Indonesianist. And we were both struck by the fact that Australian students had no great interest in Asia, or they were intimidated by the complexity of Asia. So understanding Asia seemed too difficult or beyond them. Whereas the Asian students, or the students of Asia in the Asian Studies, Asian History stream, often had a rather disdainful attitude towards Australia and Australian history. You know, there was nothing there worth putting alongside China's 6,000 years of civilization, etc. So one of the things that we thought was necessary was to try and bring these two groups together. So while I had those images lurking in the back of my mind of the kind that I've just discussed, it also became clear to me that I didn't have much of an idea of what that history was, you know, what the history of Australian connection to Asia or thinking about Asia, the Australian imagination when it came to Asia. I didn't have much understanding of what that was myself. So together, John and I cleverly decided to put on a boutique little course on Australian perceptions of Asia. And then Geoffrey Blaney, 1984, made his explosive statement about immigration, Asian immigration running ahead of public opinion. And that boutique little course turned out to be rather larger than either of us expected or anticipated. So in a sense, the marrying of an academic or scholarly or research interest in the subject to those earlier memories, which had always intrigued me and puzzled me, was a product of the 1980s. That moment, if you like.
Yeah. We should come back to that question about the connection between the contemporary debate and ongoing research and historical studies. But just as you got into it, I mean, in the early part, there were different kinds of images of Asia. A couple of them were reasonably dominant. One was of Asia as was feminine and passive, and one was masculine and threatening. I mean, I know there were many others, but do you think that these ideas still persist in Australian thinking about Asia?
Yes, I think they do. I mean, it's not easy to trace them always, but I think often in those, like at a moment now where there's a lot of tension and conflict between Australia and China, I think a lot of that masculinist language of standing up and you know, facing off and so on tends to come to the fore. So that confrontational rhetoric, if you like, and that those manly poses come to be more important in the way those debates are framed, and they often link pretty directly to various kinds of military conflict and military hardware, soldierly prowess, and so on. So, whereas often if you looked at the history of Australian responses to Japan, they often moved very interestingly across that spectrum. So that when in the late 19th century, there was often a very keen interest or curiosity about Japan. That was often couched in a feminine. There was a feminine rhetoric around that. It was about dainty fans and arts and crafts and so on. But when, after the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-5, when military Japan comes to the fore, then it's a much more masculinized set of images. So that what you need in order to combat rising Japan is manly prowess and military capacities.
Yeah, one of the fascinating aspects, particularly of Stranded Nation, is the way in which you've been able to find and surface dissenting or opposing voices in the whole discussion. Can you talk a little bit about that and how important and influential they were or became in affecting or even changing Australia's attitudes?
Yes, I mean, I think the argument I'd run here, I think, is that nations need a kind of diversity of opinion around how they might engage, in this case, engage Asia, or if you go back to the late 19th century, a diversity of opinion around immigration and white Australia. So in the late 19th century example, historians, I think, have tended to argue that there have been so few dissenting voices against white Australia that they're hardly worth taking into account. You know, that everyone agreed that Australia had to be white, had to be racially exclusionary, and so on. So we didn't waste our time on the people who thought otherwise. But in fact, if you go into that history, some of the counter arguments are both very interesting in themselves, but they also sit there, I think, as a kind of cultural resource which a nation can later draw upon when it needs other kinds of arguments, when it needs another narrative, if you like, when it needs to think differently about its relationships to the region and the world. So the counter narratives may seem small and insignificant, and the people uttering those positions may seem entirely marginal, but we often find that the marginal voice of the 1880s and the 1890s becomes a much more dominant, a much more fully articulated, much more richly articulated position 50, 70 or 100 years later. Another example is actually this notion of Australia as a Pacific nation, which I think first emerged, one of the first fully developed arguments about Australia as a Pacific nation came up in the 1880s, and it was a pretty interesting position put forward by a journalist of the time. Very much a minority view, because Australia was still part of the British imperial world. It didn't want to think of itself as a Pacific nation. But by 1939, the term had sort of gradually risen up the hierarchy, if you like. And so it's Menzies in first radio broadcast on becoming Prime Minister in 1939 tells the Australian people that they are a Pacific nation. And it goes to this question of what's the Far East to the European world, to Britain and the European world, is the near north to Australia. So that those arguments can resurface and represent themselves in a different light. But I think cultures need that kind of dissenting voice, need those alternate voices, because they can come into play at another time and in different circumstances.
Yeah, and we also need the alternative stories. Jing mentioned at the beginning that I'm involved in a project to establish in Sydney a museum of Chinese in Australia. And this has led me to the discovery of a lot of history that I knew nothing about, an enormous amount of oral history that has been conducted with Chinese Australians by the National Library and by people in the regions in New England and here in Sydney and so on, all over. And there is underneath these debates that were going on, there is an extraordinary richness, which is generally not reflected in mainstream history. The stories that are there are in some ways almost caricatures. The stories that are in the kind of mainstream history, the goldfields, for example,
yes,
becomes a caricature in the way it's been told, and a counter to that then becomes what I call victim history. You know, the Chinese and the Asians as victims of the kind of white oppression, but actually there were large numbers of Asian people in Australia leading extraordinarily rich and productive lives, contributing to the development of the Australian economy and to the cultural diversity of Australia, including in their relationships with First Australians. And I wanted to ask you about that because, you know, your narratives, they touch on this question of the relationship, particularly between Chinese and First Australians. How do you think that has gone? Where is it traveling now?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting subject now, isn't it? Because I know the artist Zhou Xiaoping, who will be known to a number of people in this webinar, has lived with Aboriginal people for some time, lived in Australia for over 30 years, and has worked with Aboriginal people. And those kinds of collaborations which Xiaoping is looking at do have a kind of deeper history than we normally recognize, and that there's often sitting in an Aboriginal story a Chinese presence. I mean, it's true, for example, for Alexis Wright, one of our foremost novelists, who has a Chinese grandfather. And Alexis has been very interested in establishing who that figure is. A slightly mysterious and difficult figure to trace historically, but nonetheless, she's very conscious of having a Chinese inheritance as well as an Aboriginal inheritance. And there's quite a lot of that in our history, I think, and sometimes it can be a kind of biological connection. In my own family, we had a figure called Luke Day, who adopted a European girl, long and complicated story, but adopted a young European girl who grew up and married into the Walker family. So there's no biological connection to Luke Day, the Chinese merchant, but there was a cultural and family connection, which was very interesting, because these were quite conservative Methodist people, the kind of people who you might imagine to be fairly much white Australia stalwarts, but who nonetheless had in the family a figure that they admired and respected and thought highly of. So, as you say, I think if you fly over the history at great height, often it can look to be a pretty arid landscape. But if you drill down into the Museum of the Chinese stories, if you drill down into those oral histories, if you get into family histories, often some much more complicated and fascinating connections emerge, and often they contradict the grand narrative of Australia's racial history in ways that we need to know, I think.
Yeah. Can I come back to the 1984 and Geoffrey Blaney?
Yeah.
And the impact that debate had on the course that you and John Ingleson had introduced at UNSW. How did that play out?
Well, the first and most disappointing result of it was that a very large number of students enrolled in a course that we hoped would have 15 to 20, Stephen. So we were, of course, keenly disappointed to discover 60 or 70 students sitting in front of us for a course about Australian perceptions of Asia. Because, in fact, we hadn't imagined that there'd be a huge interest in the subject. But the immigration debate, which Geoffrey Blaney sparked in 1984, and the argument, as I indicated, that Asian immigration was running ahead of Australian public opinion, that we were Asianising more quickly than Australians wanted, sparked a lot of interest at New South Wales. And New South Wales was also a university with a very large number of international students, Asian students, and a large, sorry, I'm a Victorian, I have to cough, and a very large number of Colombo Plan students. So what we found, I think, was that there was a great deal more interest in this subject than we had anticipated, but also in ways that pleased us. I think it did provide something of the bridge that we wanted between Australian students who thought Asia was too difficult and students of Asia who thought that Australia was beneath contempt and not worth looking at. So I think in a way we established that there was a subject there, if you like, and that again goes to one of the starting points for my own project, because in the noble tradition of academic teaching, John and I were keeping about a week ahead of our students, but we were having to get on top of a subject that we knew mattered and was important, but which we hadn't got into in a research sense ourselves.
that interest on the part of students continued quite strongly through the 80s
Yes.
and into the 90s. But then in the latter part of the 90s, it started to fall away. And part of the reason for that was, in my view, a change of government, which declared that Australia was definitely not a part of Asia. And we knew who we were, and we were definitely not Asian. A combination of that, of the Asian financial crisis, when Australian leaders declared that the miracle economies were not up there in Asia, we were the miracle economy. And I think that the Pauline Hanson episode had some influence on that in the sense that the Prime Minister waited for 9 months before making any slightly critical statement about that, and even then his statement was quite equivocal. And universities around Australia began to notice by the end of the 90s a quite significant fall off in student demand for Asian studies, Asian languages, particularly in Indonesian, but not only in Indonesian. And I don't believe that the study of Asia has ever really recovered from that. I think the numbers show that it hasn't recovered. So that if today, well, I don't know that we even need a Geoffrey Blaney to have a public debate about these issues. But it does not seem to have had that kind of effect on student demand. And I wonder, although I haven't got numbers to prove it, I wonder whether it's had almost an opposite effect. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that in some ways, that the shine has gone off Asian studies. You know, that the idea that you would be encountering something exciting and revelatory, something that would spark the imagination and fire the imagination, I think has diminished. And also, as soon as you get into if you like, the securitized debate around, you know, are we threatened? Are we menaced? Are we endangered? Then that sucks a lot of the juice out of the discussion in a way. I mean, it makes it a much more instrumentalist and narrow discussion about where our interests stand and whether those interests are threatened. So in some ways it takes us back to some of the older stories about invasion, about us being taken over, about our culture being obliterated or removed, and that above all we must protect it and look after it and value it, which of course we must always do anyhow, but not in opposition to Asia, it seems to me. But there is, I think there's certainly a larger set of concerns around just the status of the arts. I mean, in the recent discussion about putting up the price of arts degrees because they're not preparing students who are job ready in order to have students funneled towards courses which are, allegedly. I think also goes to that question of diminishing the the cultural reserves, if you like, the intellectual reserves of the nation, and goes to your question about the progressive weakening of Asian studies in Australia. It's a kind of diminishing resource, and the fewer people we have who are versed in these subjects, the less prepared we are, the less capable we are of addressing the questions that arise about Australia's place in the region.
governments in the 1980s were sending very strong messages about Asia, about the interest of Asia, the importance of Asia, about the need for Australia to become, in Bob Hawke's word, enmeshed with Asia. And I think the messages coming from government do have an effect. And so we saw then the negative messages coming in the 1990s. And since then, to the extent that we've had initiatives, they have been really misleading and not real. I mean, the Asian Century, for example, the initiative started by Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister. It was maybe a fine idea, but she set up a committee to develop a strategy for the Asian Century, and there was not a single Asian Australian on that committee. There was not, when they had an implementation plan, there was not an Asian on the implementation committee, apart from Peter Varghese, who was the head of DFAT and whose family were of South Asian origin. But he was there ex officio because he was the head of DFAT, not because anyone thought that he might represent an Asian Australian point of view. And while it made grand statements about the need for Australia to be studying Asian languages and societies, it put not a penny into this. And so the messages coming from government have been not positive and often negative. You've got the narrative about China, which is very negative, and the impact on student demand, I think, has been really bad, and it's very bad for the nation. I can't remember a time like this. It was not as bad as this, even, I think, in the 60s and early 70s at the time of the Vietnam War. The rhetoric around China and around Chinese people in Australia is really very strong. And for Chinese Australians and Asian Australians in general, it's very damaging. Now, it's true that back in the 60s, at the time of the Vietnam War, we didn't have such significant numbers of Asian Australians as we have now. But nevertheless, we did have, and the anti-communist, anti-China, pro-Vietnam rhetoric didn't, I don't think it translated into a similar kind of negativity about Asian people. I don't know whether that's your impression or not, but the impression I have is that today it is certainly in my lifetime unprecedented.
Yes, I mean, I think if you go back to, I mean, Stranded Nation does have a look at the Colombo Plan, students, Asian visitors, and so on. My sense of that period is that there was often in the Australian population a recognition that on the one hand, we had a pretty brutal immigration policy, but there was a sense, I think, in which many people felt that that was misrepresented what Australians were, and that there was quite a deal of curiosity about Asia, about Colombo Plan students, and about Asian cultures. And some of the people that I've talked to from that period, Lucky Jayasuriya being one, but Lucky would say that actually the Australia of the 1950s and 60s was in many ways very warm, hospitable and receptive. You know, there's a lot of curiosity about the world that he'd come from. And the book goes into some of that with other visitors. You know, there was just a thirst for knowledge and information and a recognition that we had something, we as a society, mainstream Australia, had something to learn from Asia and from the Asian visitors who were coming in either as Colombo Plan students or as private students or under the Asian visitors scheme. So I think there was a kind of openness and a receptivity there, an open-mindedness, which did lead in to some of those later formulations about Asia literacy, enmeshment, and engagement. So those things were not necessarily a radical break with the past, but a kind of, again, drawing on that argument of cultural resources, they were, you know, in a way, a reformulation or an amplification of earlier arguments. I mean, polishing them up and getting them up to speed for different circumstances. So I think there was a kind of intellectual curiosity, there was a cultural interest, and in a teaching environment, that's absolutely essential. I mean, if students don't get a sense of excitement from the idea of their study of another place or another culture, then they're very sensibly not going to do it. You know, they're just not going to be interested. And I think the other thing is that going back to the white paper that you referenced, so much of that language was pretty narrowly instrumentalist. You know, it was what we would benefit, how we would benefit from proximity to Asia, how our markets would grow and our trade surpluses would improve and our GDP would benefit and so on. And all of those things, you know, we all love GDP, especially in a pandemic, when it's going backwards. But that's not all there is. You know, you really need something more, a more robust conceptualization of what our place in the region might be and what we might learn from the region, what we might gain from the region, how that might enrich and deepen us.
Yep. And of course, on that point, it was not just that Colombo Plan students found a warmth and receptivity, but they themselves were a kind of seeding machine in Australian society. I mean, many of them boarded. They boarded out, and the family or the landlady that they boarded with found here was this charming, delightful, intelligent person who was really a beaut to get to know.
Yes.
And I think that they, in their own way, they had an influence on the way that changed. But on this question of that other dimension to our relations with Asia, I think we've lost that in many ways. The instrumentalist thing, which began in the late 90s, has continued and strengthened. And when Bob Hawke talked about enmeshment, he meant across the board.
Yes.
And above all, Bob Hawke meant the relationship with people. Hawke, who I knew quite well, Hawke really liked Asian people. You could tell it when you saw him. You know, the interactive, the body language, everything. He really responded well, and so it was natural that when he thought about our relations with Asia, he thought in terms of people and the society and the cultures and so on. And Hawke, the Hawke government and the Keating government, they worked at that. And Gareth Evans, when he was foreign minister, and they worked very hard at our relations with the ASEAN countries, to an extent that by the time they lost government, Australia had a really rather unusual relationship with those Southeast Asian countries. Gareth tells a story that he was at a meeting somewhere in Asia. It was either an APEC meeting or a meeting that brought together most of the Asian countries, and Australia had a seat there. And in the break, in mid-morning, he's walking down the corridor, and he walked into a room thinking it was a coffee room or something like that, and it wasn't. It was the ASEAN foreign ministers were in there having a little meeting. They're caucusing, and Gareth said, "Oops, oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong room." And several of them said, "Come on in, you're one of us."
Yeah.
Now, it's difficult to imagine that happening to an Australian minister in Asia today, in any part of Asia, actually, whether it's Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia or anywhere else.
Yes.
And that's where I think we've got to.
Yes. Well, going back, Stephen, to the point you make about the visitors. I mean, one of the stories that intrigued me was of an Indian farmer who came out to Australia in the late 1950s, a man called Narkadi. And I tell his story in the book. And Narkadi was a very charming fellow. And he went into a boarding house in Melbourne. And the boarding house lady was intrigued by Narkadi, by his exercises, by his various regimens and so on. And what was very striking, I think, in that story was exactly what you're pointing to, I think, was a depth of curiosity and interest that was mutual. I mean, Narkadi was very interested in the boarding house woman because she had a position of prominence and a kind of economic power and influence. She was forthright and outspoken and all the rest of it in ways that were unusual for Narkadi. So he was seeing something that was unfamiliar to him, but sure as hell, she was seeing something that was pretty unfamiliar to her as well. And it was, in a sense, the difference, the recognition of a kind of difference that excited them and got them to know each other a whole lot better. And many of these stories were replicated across the culture. And one of the arguments I run in the book is that it was in fact Colombo Plan students. I think more than Australian historians have recognised, it was Colombo Plan students and Asian visitors who made Australians aware of the sterility of many of the arguments about Asian exclusion around the White Australia policy, that these people had been so often represented as abstractions before the Second World War. They had no face, if you like, and no voice. But once they were admitted into Australia from the 1950s, and they had faces, voices, skills, talents and abilities, Australians came to understand that the people that they were seeking to exclude were often extremely intelligent, extremely capable, very charming. They had no particular problem fitting into Australian ways of life, and so on and so on. So that the rationale for their exclusion was, to a very large extent, I think, undermined by Colombo Plan students, by Asian visitors themselves through the 1950s and 60s. And we often give ourselves credit for seeing the limitations of the White Australia policy, and there's something in that. But I think we must also acknowledge that the visitors who came in and the students who came in played a much bigger role than we've previously acknowledged in showing us the limitations of our own thinking and the limitations of our own imagination around questions of engagement, enmeshment, race, and so on.
Can I say to those attending this webinar who haven't read the book, or those who have for that matter, that I think one of the great interests of Stranded Nation is that there's a big chunk on Asian voices about Australia. A great deal of what is written by and said by Australians about our relations with Asia is all about what we think, where we are. It's all our reference point. And very few are interested in going around the other side and seeing how we look from an Asian point of view, whether it's from China or Japan or Southeast Asia, India, wherever. And a lot of the typical of this was when universities back in the 90s were first put in a position by the twisting of government funding, of having to go out and get international students. I was giving strategic advice to a number of Australian universities, and when I spoke to them, they said, "Oh, we've got a strategy. We're going to have a partnership with, let's say, Peking University." And every time I would say, "Have you asked Peking University what they think about that?"
Yeah.
"Oh, no, but you know, that's what we're going to do." And I mean, it sounds really odd, but that's how it was. So you just assume we're going to do this, and not going around, not having the curiosity to go around the other side and see what those people thought. Did Australian University X even feature anywhere in the strategic plan of Peking University? So in a broader national sense, I think it's extremely important to get these Asian voices, to listen to them, and as you have done in this book, to surface them in a very interesting and wonderfully readable way with great anecdotes.
Actually, can I say quickly, and thank you for that, Stephen, that's much appreciated, of course, for a struggling author. But with the Colombo Plan students, one of the really interesting things about that, how the government treated their opinions when they were adverse or critical, was very, very interesting, I think. And it goes to the point that you've made, that the government would often assume that they understood what the point of view of the Colombo Plan students. So you didn't need to ask them what they thought about the White Australia policy or some other question. Government assumed that they knew what they were thinking, so they would speak on their behalf. So through the 1950s and 60s, while there's curiosity and interest, there's also this tendency, rather haughty tendency, to know what I refer to in the book as the Asian mind, what the Asian mind was up to. So we can speak to it or speak about it and on its behalf, without necessarily going to it and asking it, to finding out, well, this is what we think you're thinking, but is that actually what you're thinking? I mean, what's your point of view? So those questions, I think, those questions about listening and withholding judgment in a way are very important. And when Karen and I were at Peking University in that period that Jing mentioned, 2013 to 2016, and I was actually embedded in the department. So I wasn't a visitor flying, I wasn't a FIFO, wasn't flying in and flying out. One of the really interesting things in that experience was that you tended to come into situations where there were differences and assume that your own cultural position was the correct one, that somehow the Chinese had got it wrong. And it was your responsibility to clarify their errors or to correct their errors. But over the 3-year period, what became much clearer was that clearly there's a Chinese point of view on this question and that question and the other question, and that what we needed to do was actually listen to it first, find out what that opinion was, what that view was, what that perspective was. You still might not agree with it, but you couldn't. Your starting position should not be disagreement or we know better. And I think there's a hell of a lot of we know better in the way we approach these questions.
Oh, well, now I can jump in with some questions from the audience and then
Sure.
we can resume. So the first question is from Kevin. Kevin, congratulate your books, David, extraordinary books. Well done. Now, the question is, currently, Australia appears to be experiencing considerable angst regarding its relationship with China. Do you see this angst as a continuation of historical attitudes in Australia about Asia and China in particular?
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for the question. I think the answer goes back to that, the point I was making earlier, that lying within the culture are competing possibilities. So that within the culture, we have a set of notions, historically embedded notions about invasive Asia, but we also have a set of other notions, more positively understood notions, more positive constructions of Asia, which we can also draw upon at different times. And I think the danger that we're in now is that in a way, the invasive Asia argument, the notion that our sovereignty is threatened, that our integrity as a nation is threatened, that our values are threatened, etc., can draw upon a quite a long tradition of anxiety, concern and apprehension that is deeply embedded in the culture. So these things become in a way mutually reinforcing, that if that's all we see or all we imagine Asia to be, then we foreclose on a whole lot of other understandings of Asia that have been an important part of our history as well. So they fall by the wayside, they fall into the background. So more constructive understandings, a greater sense of curiosity, a greater sense of mutual benefit, of shared interests and so on. A lot of those things fall away or diminish in importance as the other story becomes the dominant one.
On back of this question, I actually have a bit of my own question on in the same vein. You know, looking back from history, obviously all this anxiety coming from this primarily lack of understanding of differences and the differences of cultural differences, racial differences, linguistic differences, primarily, you know, way back. Now, all these differences more or less have been eased to a point. You know, Australia knows a lot more about Asia, a lot more about Asian cultures, although, you know, there is a way to go. But still, you know, where Australia was to where Australia is now, that has moved a lot. Now, coming to the terms of current tension with China, it seems more not necessarily about cultural differences or even racial differences to a point, but it's more about ideological differences, like what you mentioned, values. So do you think, you know, like cultural differences, racial differences, linguistic differences over the time, there is point people can reach agreement to we can coexist? What do you think of these ideological differences?
Yeah, I mean, on the racial dimension of what you're addressing there, Jing, I think there is a sense in which, you know, going through our history, that Asia is so different. I mean, it is so incompatibly different that there is a kind of expectation that Asia in inverted commas, will stand outside of Australia, that it is in an adversarial position towards Australia, which goes back, I think, also to Kevin's question, so that there is a kind of readiness, I think, to imagine Asia as an adversary because of those those kinds of very deeply embedded senses of difference than there is to see points of collaboration and common interest. So I would frame it as an argument in which there is a worrying resilience about the adversarial and in some ways racially embedded understanding of Asian difference and a fragility around the cultural connectedness of the sense of common purpose and common interest, that can so easily be overrun or overtaken in times of stress. And of course, the pandemic has helped intensify a lot of those stresses, and equally the unpredictable and reckless nature of the US presidency is intensifying those stresses as well. And in a sense, Australia's caught up in a world that's grown appreciably more irritable over the last, 4, 5, 6 years.
Thank you. We have the second question from Jake. Hi, David. Very interesting talk. Building on your discussion of the Blaney debate, I'd like to know your view on the Whitlam government's decision to cut immigration 10 years earlier, bringing an end to the post-war consensus of a favor to a mass immigration program. To what extent do you believe this was about appeasing anti-Asian sentiment in the electorate, especially given fears about increased Asian migration after the abolition of the official white Australian policy? I think both of you can answer that question.
Yes. Thanks for the question, Jake. And I'm so glad Stephen's sitting there as well, because I might recruit him for the cause as well. I mean, I think there was clearly a degree of nervousness around the politics of Asian immigration. And it had been such a non-negotiable issue through the 1950s and 60s. There was widespread recognition, I think, in Australia at the level of the top bureaucracy and so on, that this policy was doing us a lot of damage, and that, if we could only moderate our immigration policy, liberalise it to some extent, then our capacity to engage the region would be so much greater, and we'd be in a better position diplomatically and so on. But the difficulty of actually acting on that understanding was profound, because the feeling was the first political party that made a move to liberalise or as many people might have seen it, weaken the White Australia Party would be for the chopper, so that it wasn't an easy kind of argument to run. So that while the Whitlam government could recognise China as it did and have a diplomatic presence there, the Asian immigration corollary was much more sensitive and politically difficult, I think. But Stephen, what's your view?
Well, on the specific question of the Vietnamese, it's on the record that Gough Whitlam actually said, well, let's look at the historical context. The Labor Party had been effectively kept out of office since the late 40s, in part through the Catholic Democratic Labor Party, the split in Labor and that Catholic wing, the Democratic Labor Party. So in the other part of the Labor Party, there was something of an obsession about this. And it's reliably reported that Whitlam said about Vietnamese refugees, they're all Catholics and they'll vote Liberal. And I believe that is true. And so it was for electoral reasons, but with that added element of
added spice.
Yeah, that added spice. Yes.
Question from Michael. Enjoy your books immensely, David, and certainly appreciate the need to understand the anxious history to hope in our understanding of Asia, Australians' modern angst concerning Asia and China in particular at the moment. But how would you factor in the increasing weight or impact of a people of Asian heritage in this understanding and its capacity, hopefully, to ameliorate this angst in the medium and long term?
Yes, yes. Thanks for the question, Michael, and thank you for the appreciation. The other thing I want to say here quickly, Jing, and in response to that question, is that books like the big fat history books like Stranded Nation can look like good medicine. You know, the kind of thing that you should swallow in order to improve your cultural health. But I want to remind people of what Stephen said, that they are very readable.
They are.
And actually the history is fascinating. I mean, in terms of a cultural history, the questions that cultural historians can get their teeth into, these are fascinating questions, actually, fascinating histories. So I don't want for a moment for people to think that it's dry old stuff, dry old medicine or difficult medicine that you have to swallow in order to be a better person. But to go to the question, I mean, one of the interesting ways of looking at the Asia question, our engagement with Asia, our connection to Asia, is to go back to that idea of there being an Asia outside, but there's also the Asia within. And the Asia within are the people that Michael referred to, but it's also that long history of connection running from the mid-19th century right through to the present. So there are a lot of stories there, as Stephen mentioned, a lot of stories of connection, of collaboration, of success, of ingenuity. And we need actually to know those stories as well, because it goes back to the cultural resource question, I think. I mean, if we don't understand that a lot of those stories are interesting, inspiring, fascinating, amusing, then we lose something important about the ways in which our connection to Asia and the Asian populations within Australia have deepened and enriched our experience. So it benefits both mainstream Australia to know those stories, but it also benefits what I'm calling the Asia within to know that history as well, to know that there is a history and there is a point of connection, but there's also a profoundly important contribution that they have made, and will continue to make and should make to the making of Australia.
Yes, but unfortunately, it's not happening naturally. That people of Asian origin are moving into obvious areas of power and influence. I believe that we're discovering, as the women's movement discovered a long time ago and feminists discovered, that you have to have affirmative action in order to kind of break through. If you look at the upper levels of the Liberal and the Labor parties in the federal parliament and in the state parliaments, it in no way reflects the composition of Australian society.
Sure.
In respect of Asians, or indeed in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And you only have to look, as I do, I rush to look at the honours list, not because I'm infatuated by the honours list, but every time it comes out, twice a year, and I do a count of the number of identifiable Asian names. And these are people who I've given recognition for their contribution to Australian society. So okay, we know it's a club, but every other thing that goes on at the top of Australian life is a club. So we're going to need a lot more of this. Tim Sutpomasani, who used to be the Race Relations
sure.
Commission in the Human Rights Commission, has started a program at the University of Sydney where he gets partners from about 30 companies. And once a year, they have a week-long program where they select Asian Australians from about the mid-levels, and they bring them together and they workshop the challenges of how to break through into the upper echelons. Now, I think that's an excellent thing to be doing, but at the same time, it's a bit of a sad reflection, the fact that we have to do that in order to break open the power structures and the influential bodies in Australian society. So we've still got a long way to go. But I think that was, Michael, that was your question, wasn't it? But it's there. And if we are self-conscious enough about it, it can be a wonderful leaven to kind of bring about change. So let's all work on it together.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree. Working together is the way to go. And I think, you know, even if there is a long way to go, but there has been some improvement as far as I can see, because when I came, you know, 1988, over 30 years ago, I was an abstractor to a point. So as David mentioned, but, you know, I guess gradually people start knowing you, and people start knowing my culture, and they start knowing there is a lot that we can learn from each other. So I still remember when I was working at Attorney General's Department as a compensation manager, and a person who just joined us, and she was so kind of surprised and excited, all sorts of mixed feelings. So she said, "You are the first Chinese boss I've ever had." You know, so I think there is a long way to go, but, you know, so to where we are today. So I think that we can be optimistic is, you know, we are moving towards that, and we do need to do more to moving towards that goal. Similar question, or no, a question in relation to this perhaps is from Eddie. Eddie says, I recently graduated from a double degree in Asian Studies and the Chinese language, and have studied at a Chinese universities throughout my degree. I was the only one in my cohort with this combination that I know of at the University of Melbourne. How can we encourage students to choose Asian studies and a language over political science or, you know, RI? And do you think an Asian studies degree is viewed as less prestigious? I know Eddie, she's Australian, you know, so it's amazing that her Chinese is wonderful.
Well, good on you, Eddie. I'm very pleased to hear that, and I think you know, well done. I mean, I think it has been one of the problems around some of the rhetoric surrounding the language of getting Asian knowledge and Asian language, that doors will fly open and all sorts of wonderful opportunities will come rushing at you, too many for you to manage. And that hasn't always been the case, I think. So a lot of those, I mean, I know of students from an earlier period who studied in China with that expectation, in this case ANU students, and they did so and derived a lot of benefit from the experience. But when they returned to Australia, the bit about doors flying open didn't quite happen. And so that I don't particularly have an answer for Eddie, which is very regrettable, but I do have a concern that, again, going to that instrumentalist question, that the skills that will be identified as the most important are in some ways the most narrowly conceived ones, and that while they're important. I mean, you need those skills and you need people doing those things, but they're not the only things that we need in this society, in this culture and at this time. So we do need people who've got the experience that Eddie's got the language that Eddie's got, and can just speak to that experience, at a time when it can be pretty hard, or at least there's not a great receptivity to stories that run counter to current anxieties and current apprehensions.
Next question, I think both of you can have something to say, is from Zhang Lanshen. And he said, "Hi, David, great to see you again here." So you must know him also.
Good.
And I understand that you discussed, what you discussed is about the previous Colombia plan. How do you think of the recent one, the new Colombia plan? Are there any fundamental difference?
Yeah, the new Colombo plan, well, the new Colombo plan was in a sense a recognition of how successful the first Colombo plan had been in educating people in Australia, who then went on to positions of very considerable influence in their own countries. So there was Australia, in a sense, discovered a tremendous benefit, almost accidentally discovered a tremendous benefit from the educational experience that many of these people had and then took back to Indonesia or Malaysia or wherever. And of course, many of them stayed on in Australia to contribute to Australia directly themselves. The new Colombo plan was then intended as a kind of reversal of that rather than Asian students coming to Australia to derive the benefit of our own considerable wisdom, we would go or send our students into Asia. And it seems to me, and I stand to be corrected on this, but it seems to me that while that had enthusiastic support from the previous Minister for Foreign Affairs, Julie, not Bishop, but anyhow, the previous Minister for Foreign Affairs, I mean, she was very keen on it and promoted it and supported it. But again, it seemed to me that the numbers in that were, again, there was a kind of rhetorical about an imbalance between what we said about it, if you like, the rhetorical investment in it, and the dollars we were prepared to put towards it. So it was much spoken of, and some very good things came from it. And when I was in Beijing, I met many of the students who were the beneficiaries of that program, but it was pretty small, and we made a hell of a lot of noise about it, but we weren't backing it with dollars in a way that we should have. It seemed to me that if we had a real conviction that this was important and this mattered, and I think it did, I think it was really a worthwhile initiative, then we should have backed it in much more strongly and much more convincingly and put more money to it.
But of course, the anomaly in that concept was the first Colombo plan. We brought people here and we expected they would go back and become influential in top positions in their own countries. In the second Colombo plan, we're sending people there, but we're not saying they should come back and go into influential positions in Australia. This kind of raises again the question of, if you've got qualifications in Indonesian or Chinese and you've studied the country or something, are you going to get a job back in Australia? And it's certainly the top end of Australian life is not populated with people who speak these languages and have studied their history.
Sure.
Yeah. Very good point about the difference. Next questions from Roy. Roy says, "Thank you for your interesting talk. Australia has been engaging with China for years, but it seems Australia still holds a great fear towards China now. Do you think, is this because neoliberalism has remained as Australia's major China narrative since the 1990s and caused to a lack of a deep understanding of China? Is that why Australia prefers to see China as a business partner and a market rather than a friend that can be trusted?
Well, I think the business partner and market is an interesting conceptualization. John Howard often spoke of, or John Howard's interest in China quickened dramatically when he discovered that the Chinese middle class and their keen interest in refrigerators and white goods and so on, products that Australia could supply. And also middle class Chinese took away a lot of that anxiety about revolutionary and proletarian China, that middle class people were stable and sensible. And then more recently, Prime Minister Morrison has spoken of China as a customer. And I have a lot of problems with both of those formulations, actually, because even if you go to the question of the customer, you need to know why customers are buying this product rather than that product. You need to know something about the culture that determines the choices that people will make about what they buy or don't buy. And it's quite interesting in relation to wine, for example, that often the Chinese will understand that the French are an extremely civilized people, and therefore their wine must be more civilized than our wine, and so on. But there's a lot of cultural baggage that goes along with these questions that are often framed as being purely economic ones. That we don't need to know the Chinese if we're going to trade with them, because all we have to do is come up with stuff that they want, and then we're okay. But that in a sense belies the question of what stuff do they want? What are their how are their cultural tastes and preferences evolving, and what do we know about that? On the larger question around anxiety about China, I think I would argue that one of the things, if you look at the history, one of the things we've been saying for a very long time, from the late 19th century onwards, is that the rise of Asia, and in particular in this, the way we think about it, the rise of Japan, the rise of China, that this is going to, in a sense, threaten us, but not yet, because throughout much of that debate and much of that discussion, Asia's been framed as the future, so it's coming, it'll happen next generation or sometime. It's not quite here yet. Now we've reached the point where it has arrived, that the rise of China is no longer a futurist project or something we might anticipate or think about as happening in the next generation or the generation after. It is with us now. And it's with us now with all the kind of cultural power that also follows economic power. And I have argued elsewhere that economic power is not the sole generator of cultural power, but it's pretty important. So that if you've got economic clout, if you've got economic power, you also have cultural power. And one of the difficulties that I think mainstream Australia is facing at the moment is coming to terms with the fact that the thing that's been so long speculated about, rise of China becoming a dominant world power, carries with it all sorts of cultural influence, political influence, and forms of power that we don't readily recognise. We prefer China to go back to the position that the supplicant position that it used to have. I'm also interested in the way, often in the current debate, we hear the word kowtow. The Chinese are teaching us to kowtow to them. Very, very culturally loaded term with a very, very fascinating history, but as if somehow we've been trained to take this position and there's no way in which we should be subservient. Well, I'm sorry, the world has changed. And the China we now face not only has economic power, it has cultural and political and strategic power as well. And, you know, we've got to kind of face that new reality, and we're struggling to do it, I think.
Okay, so next a question from Sharon. And Sharon said, I really enjoy Eddie's question, and thanks a lot to David's detailed response. I am a Chinese international student majoring in Asian studies and sociology. Asian studies is not popular major to Chinese students because it seems to be less practical and has nothing to do with the migration if they want to get a permanent residency. I love my major, but also consider going to the education or business sector if I realize that I do not have the capacity to devote my life in academic research. Do you have any suggestions for Chinese international students who are passionate about arts and humanities, but also concerning about their career paths in the Asian, Australian space?
Well, yes. I mean, I do hope you can retain, sustain, and be rewarded by your passion and your interest, because it seems to me that we do best where we're following questions, pursuing questions that really engage us and interest us, and that we're better for being able to do that. But I certainly understand the need to translate that into something that will put food on the table, because it's terrific to have deep wisdom about a subject while starving, or while driving a taxi or something. So the hope that you'd have to have is, I think, that in our institutions there's enough need for the cultural knowledge that we require for effective economic activity, for effective economic engagement, for effective political engagement, that we cannot do these things properly or well unless we have people who have those Asian studies and Asian languages skills. So this is too difficult a problem for Sharon to solve on her own, but I would support what Steve had to say about the need for us to be much more forthright and creative and imaginative in making the case that we need these skills. They're enormously important to our well-being in the region. Now, I'm sorry to say that me saying that is not going to have a job offer drop through the email for Sharon, but I'd very much love that to be the case. If it is the case, please let me know.
Could I just add?
Sure.
Look, I really sympathise with this. It's getting on for 30 years that I've had students kind of raise this kind of issue with me. Look, I studied this language, and I've done history, or in this case sociology, and look, I can't get a job. The optimistic answer is to say, well, yes, if you've finished a sociology degree, by all means have a look at another one that's going to give you a pathway to employment. But the sociology degree will stand you in very good stead. And as employers are now reporting more and more often, people with arts degrees are actually very valuable in their businesses, even those which are about technology and engineering and so on. So please, again, I can't be any more use than David about offers dropping from the sky. But don't give up on sociology. It's important, as is history.
Well, I really fully agree, because I think it may take a while. You may not, as a job offer, just drop from your email straight away. But I think if you insist, so you may be able to get there. And when I was studying over 30 years ago, at Sydney University, Australian literature, I was the only Chinese student studying. And many people asked me, why are you studying Australian literature? So I said, I have nothing better to do. So I just love it, so nothing else. So, but, in the end, I get to where I want to be, and take a while, but I think eventually you will get there if you persist. So that's my piece of advice. We have a last question, but I think we run out of time, Maggie. So Maggie's asking about Australian policy. Are they parallel to American policy? But I will get that answer to you. I know, Maggie, so I will get the answer to you from David and Stephen, just because we ran out of time. And today is a really long session. People need to go to make dinner, all sorts. So first of all, thank you so much, Professor David Walker and Professor Stephen FitzGerald. It's such an interesting talk, and there's so much you two know of, and we can keep on talking. And last thing on David's book, I have to say it again. Yes, truly so readable, and echoing both Stephen and other people, Michael, response. It's just so readable, very enjoyable, and you don't feel like you're reading a history book at all. It's really like a fiction, but it's not a fiction. So yes, highly recommend. And also the book about your family history, Not Yet Dark. I also love that book, and make me laugh. It's a lot of a great sense of humor there too. So thank you both, and thank you all, audience, and I hope you all enjoyed the session, and we will have the recorded session put on our website, and and you can watch it or recommend to friends. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you, Jing.
Thank you, Jing.
David.
Thank you, Steve.